January the 30th, 1933. Hitler on his way to power. A few hundred men were ordered to shout, "Heil, mein Führer." Could this have been just another change of government? The pictures convey an atmosphere of normality. A conservative cabinet with a new chancellor. The gentleman was chosen by us, but we will rule, said von Papen, the vice-chancellor. We being the old elites. But Hitler had never been in any doubt about it. Once he gained power, he would never let go. Was no one listening? It appeared to be a straightforward change of government, but it wasn't. Germany under the swastika. Germany on the march, straight into dictatorship. Those who did not march in step were hunted down. The reign of terror was established overnight. This footage was filmed secretly. An American film from this period, made by a young German Jew who had got out in time. Shock, fear, terror. The person who had seized power in Germany was no actor.
Ein Diktator, der etwas...
A dictator who understands power,
der bereit war,
who was prepared to use the necessary brutality and violence,
einzusetzen,
and whose exercise of power had extremely dire consequences.
bewerkstelligt hat.
10 days after insinuating himself into power, Hitler appeared publicly for the first time as Reichschancellor at a rally in the Berlin Sports Palace. There was a huge turnout. Only dictatorship can achieve this, as Hitler would remark again and again. People stayed away from the Democrats. His slogans were still the same, only now they had added weight. He wanted to tidy things up. Few Germans cared precisely how. Finally, a man for sweeping changes.
Der Kampf gegen den Marxismus wurde damals zum ersten Mal zu einem Kampfziel erhoben. Damals gelobte ich mir zum ersten Mal als unbekannter Eiserner diesen Krieg zu beginnen und nicht zu ruhen, bis endlich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben beseitigt sein würde.
His was the art of saying something and not saying it. He didn't shout. He roared into the microphones in the newsreels they showed at the time. I'd say his views were pretty clear.
Wir wollen arbeiten, aber das Volk selbst, es muss mithelfen. Es soll nie glauben, dass ihm plötzlich Freiheit, Glück und Leben vom Himmel geschenkt wird.
He wrote in Mein Kampf, "The people are so stupid. You just feed them the same slogans every day and they'll obey."
Wir wollen nicht liegen, wollen nicht schwindeln. Ich habe deshalb es abgelehnt, jemals vor dieses Volk hinzutreten und billige Versprechungen zu geben.
The Reichstag was burning, hot enough to drive out the communists. Then books burned in Germany. Later, people. Hitler eliminated political opponents. Carried off into cellars and so-called wild camps, they were tortured and tormented. The majority of the population remained silent. It didn't concern them. For the moment, it only affected others. Germany was being knocked into shape, blow by blow, systematically. There was a new order for everything. Hitler called it Gleichschaltung, marching in step. There were no longer basic rights under the law. Freedom of assembly and of the press were repealed. A state of emergency was in force. Revolution from above, terror and a confused sense of things falling apart. Yet another election in March '33. Hitler wanted a better result, confirmation from the people. Again he appeared as the tireless campaigner. He remained calm. He had resolved, if the election cannot decide it, then the decision will be reached by other means. These were the last democratic elections in Germany, but hardly free and equal. The aging president had made Hitler socially acceptable. Did he have any idea whom he had appointed?
Diese Wahl wird für Deutschland und auch für die Welt von entscheidender Bedeutung sein.
Von Papen was right about that. The election did not bring an absolute majority for Hitler. He said angrily that he wouldn't get rid of the old gang, the conservatives who had given him a hand. A show was put on for the first sitting of the Reichstag in Potsdam. Hitler in a frock coat. A petty bourgeois who conjured up a Prussian tradition. All a masquerade. He didn't much care for Prussians. That the aged field marshal still marched with the leaders added an impressive touch of sentimentality. In the venerable Garrison Church, Hitler courted the parliament.
Die Regierung der nationalen Erhebung ist entschlossen, ihre von dem deutschen Volk übernommene Aufgabe zu erfüllen. Sie tritt daher heute hin vor den Deutschen Reichstag mit dem heißen Wunsch, in ihm eine Stütze zu finden.
A symbolic handshake. The old and new Germany appeared to be one. This day at Potsdam was a milestone in Hitler's journey to absolute rule. The bourgeoisie had to make peace with him.
To me, it was an utter farce. I didn't take it seriously. I saw it for the sham it was.
Could Hitler still have been stopped? Even critical minds were dazzled. They forgot that violence had ruled since the day Hitler came into office. People thought things couldn't get any worse. He fooled everyone, and almost everyone fooled themselves about him. 2 days later, the worthy man showed his true face. Dressed in the brown shirt of the SA, Hitler marched into the Kroll Opera House for the first session of the Reichstag. No longer a parliament, from now on it would meet here. Armed SA were there to intimidate the remaining Democrats. The Reichstag decided to dissolve itself. Only the Social Democratic Party voted against it. Now Hitler had all power in his hands. Democracy had been eliminated and the dictatorship had been recognized, apparently legally.
After the Enabling Act was passed, one man clearly had the power to do as he pleased. He was no longer answerable to any authority. He embodied the state, so to speak.
From now on, the constitution of this new state was his will. What this meant soon became clear. A Opponents disappeared en masse to the so-called organized concentration camps. Dachau was the first. Everyone could read the reports in the Volkischer Beobachter of the day in Potsdam when Hitler promised law and order.
We wanted to go on leading our young lives without interference, but they said we'd sinned against the state. Not against National Socialism, but against the state, the Reich, the national uprising. All this was put into big words. This was the section on attempted high treason, total despotism. The way people were treated, whether they were tortured or not, could only happen in a dictatorship.
Meine Herren, seit dem 30. Januar hat sich in Deutschland eine Umwälzung vollzogen, die in unserer Geschichte einst mit Recht als die nationale Revolution bezeichnet werden wird. Dass ein solcher geschichtlicher Vorgang wie jede Kampfhandlung hier und da auch von bedauerlichen Erscheinungen begleitet ist, liegt auf der Hand.
The sneering words showed what was going on in Germany. Jews were no longer Germans. That's the way Hitler wanted it. It would end at Auschwitz. Those who could left Germany before it was too late. They included the intellectual elite of Germany: Thomas Mann, Kortner, Richard Tauber, Lubitsch had already left, and Albert Einstein. Now the real Germans were all together. Numbness and utter cynicism, somehow these feelings complemented one another. Anyone still capable of endangering Hitler's claim to power was eliminated. On the outside, he manifested harmony, even with the unions. He, of all people, proclaimed May the 1st Labor Day, the national holiday people had wanted for so long. But he had no time for the labor movement. The end of the unions had long been ordained for the next day.
Deutsche Volksgenossen und Genossinnen, der Mai ist gekommen.
Armed SA commandos stormed union buildings and arrested officials. Members and assets were absorbed into the German Labour Front, with no resistance and no general strike.
Am 30. Januar sind in Deutschland die Würfel gefallen. Und ich glaube nicht, dass die Gegner, die damals noch gelacht haben, heute auch noch lachen.
Many Germans were satisfied. The end of the political parties did not worry them, and the National Socialists became the state party. Many people had been waiting for Hitler to come along. He fulfilled their desire for a strong man, someone at last who took drastic action, who cleaned up the quarreling among the parties, someone who provided peace and order, someone who assumed responsibility. Many Germans did not just tolerate the system, they were part of it. An army of accomplices, officials, snoopers, informers. Who did what, when, and how. The Germans were not just a nation led, but a nation of many little leaders.
The spying on one another was certainly not officially ordered, but was willingly carried out and was soon prevalent. People knew how Germans should behave and think, and it was obvious if somebody didn't think like that.
One personnel problem remained with Hitler, one from his own ranks, an old friend and fighting companion, Ernst Röhm, chief of the SA, mostly one step behind Hitler. The SA was a 3 million strong army of brawlers who had fought on the streets to secure Hitler's power. After that, his thugs settled some old scores, but the hoped-for rush to power and sinecures failed to materialize. Their leader acts as if he was still one of them.
Die große Zeit ist jetzt angebrochen, auf die wir 14 Jahre lang gehofft hatten. Deutschland ist nun erwacht. Da möchte ich euch jetzt danken, dass ihr nicht dankend geworden seid, dass ihr mich in der Zeit nicht verlassen habt. Denn nur euch allein ist ja das alles zuzuschreiben. Wenn ihr damals gegangen wärt, niemals wäre Deutschland mehr gerettet worden. Und ihr müsst heute nun aber auch die unerschütterliche Kampftruppe sein der nationalen Revolution.
Hitler's revolution didn't go far enough for Röhm. Besides, he wanted more power. The SA and Reichswehr should be a people's army under his command. Röhm's demands became more and more aggressive. The German army command was put on alert. Hitler had to make a decision. It wasn't difficult. He needed the German army command for the war which he had long been planning. Hitler ordered the killing of Röhm.
In dieser Stunde war ich verantwortlich für das Schicksal der deutschen Nation und damit des deutschen Volkes oberster Gerichtsherr.
In August 1934, President von Hindenburg died. He had come to like the strong Chancellor. Hitler appointed himself head of state. Führer was what he wanted to be called. He now had absolute power. Guten Tag, Herr Reichskanzler, became Heil, mein Führer, waving goodbye to the old days with the new German salute.
Führer, mein Gott! Ich schwöre bei Gott! Diesen heiligen Eid! Diesen heiligen Eid! Dass ich dem Führer des Deutschen Reiches und Volkes den Führer des Deutschen Reiches und Volkes Adolf Hitler
Der Eid war ein sehr geschicktes Mittel.
The oath was a very clever means of building a bridge with the old tradition, and a means of binding some of the hesitant officers, who were strong monarchists, to National Socialism.
Für viele, die ihrer Gesinnung nach
For many people who would have tended later to join the resistance, I know this from my own experience, the oath was an obstacle they could not overcome.
Und dann hat es sicherlich aber auch
There certainly were a considerable number of people who used the oath as a form of exoneration,
benutzt haben,
so they could tell themselves,
sagen zu können, ich
I can't disobey this man, because I swore the oath.
diesen Eid geschworen habe.
Höre Adolf Hitler!
The oath as thanksgiving for murder. The rival had been eliminated.
Jederzeit! Jederzeit! Für diesen Eid! Für diesen Eid! Ein Leben einzusetzen! Ein Leben einzusetzen! Ich höre Adolf Hitler!
September 1934. Peace reigns across the land. Hitler arrives at Nuremberg for the week-long celebration of the Reich Party Conference. Hitler now had absolute rule over Germany. The hit propaganda film was Triumph of the Will, a presumptuous will.
Dass ihr mich gefunden habt, einen unter so vielen Millionen, das ist das Wunder. Und dass ich euch gefunden habe, das ist Deutschlands Glück.
Germany's good fortune was put into uniform. The Germans were gleichgeschaltet, made to toe the line. Hitler covered the country with a network of organizations. It was hardly possible to elude his claims to power.
Wo sind hier die Demokratien der anderen Länder? Wo ist es möglich, dass Volk und Führung, Nation und Regierung in solcher Art ineinander übergehen und neben und beieinander stehen?
The show had a name, the Party Conference of the Will. One phrase expressing a program and a concept of the state, the will of the dictator.
Der Staat befiehlt uns, sondern wir befehlen dem Staate. Nicht der Staat hat uns geschaffen, sondern wir schaffen uns unseren Staat.
The integration of the Germans into Nazi organizations was the cement holding Hitler's dictatorship together. The individual did not count, only the mass. Only one person stood out, the dictator. It was a society marching in step. The new self-esteem wore a uniform. Hitler had to coerce only very few. He gave the people what they most missed, belief that they were great and important.
People knew it was horrific and had a very sinister side to it. Of course they knew that, and it was obvious, but that was suppressed. It couldn't be mentioned. And if anyone had pointed out the dark side, they would have risked their life.
The
Gestapo wasn't just a friendly lot who said, "Come and have a little chat with us." You stayed there a long time. From the very beginning, people began to realize the first concentration camps had opened. It was no joke. The state was everywhere.
One place the state didn't reach, into the little corners of private happiness. But pictures like these weren't shown in the newsreels. Apart from this, the state had the Germans firmly in its grasp. Hitler had the man for the job, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS. His world order troop became the tool of the dictatorship.
Von ihnen aus war man ein Nichtmensch, eine Unperson.
They saw us as non-human, unpersons. So they gave free rein to their feelings because they'd been drilled and brought up to do so. It was in the interest of the state.
Above Himmler, ruler of this shadowy Reich, stood only one man.
Hitler, Gehorsam bis in den Tod. So wahr wir verpfändet.
With God on their lips and blood on their hands, the law was broken in Germany. Whoever was capable of endangering the state was snuffed out, shut away. A vague suspicion, a conjecture was enough. The people were deprived of their rights in the name of the state and saw no harm in it.
Es ist die Aufgabe der Justiz, mitzuhelfen an der Erhaltung und Sicherung des Volkes vor jenen Elementen, die sich als Asoziale entweder den gemeinsamen Verpflichtungen zu entziehen trachten oder sich an diesen gemeinsamen Interessen versündigen.
Der Nationalsozialismus
ist Ausgangspunkt, Inhalt und Ziel des nationalsozialistischen Rechtsdenkens geworden.
One couldn't protest. How could you in a dictatorship? Young people sometimes ask me why we didn't demonstrate. No one would have come out of a demonstration alive. No, one simply couldn't protest.
Of course I was afraid. There was an atmosphere of fear at that time. At no time could you really breathe freely and deeply. It wasn't possible. Instead, at every moment you'd think, wait a while.
Und wenn ich, mein Führer, Sie hier in unserer Mitte weiß, so möchte ich Ihnen als einer Ihrer ältesten Kameraden sagen, durch die Beziehung des deutschen Volkes zu Ihnen ist zum ersten Mal in der Geschichte des deutschen Volkes der Begriff Liebe zum Führer ein Rechtsbegriff geworden.
Wo deutsche Herzen wieder höher schlagen, wo deutsche Arme wieder rüstig schaffen und deutsche Kinder wieder fröhlich lachen, bist du. Wir tragen dich in unserem Herzen. Du bist der Führer, Deutschlands Retter. Du bist die Treue. Du bist die Liebe, unser Glaube. Ich liebe dich aus Herzensgrund. Dein will ich sein. Dir will ich dienen. Jeden Tag und jede Stunde. Als treuer Kämpfer. Tapferster Soldat.
The cult of the Führer was for him not simply a necessary evil to hold on to power. He himself believed in the picture he had created. Germany was to become like him, his own work of art. That was his ideal, martial. All was ready for battle. As foremost architect of the state, he had models made of his dreams. Above all, gigantic, colossal, the temples of a great illusion. Even after 1,000 years, they were meant to continue to proclaim the greatness of his Reich. People were petrified in the monumental. Their lives were null. Only one person counted.
Ein wahrer Ritter ohne Furcht und Tadel, so hat die Fahne der Kultur, der Menschheit und so hat die Fahne der Kultur, der Menschheit und der Zivilisation in seine starke Hand genommen und sie erhobenen Hauptes der Drohung und dem Ansturm der Weltrevolution entgegengetragen.
Hitler in Bayreuth. Wagner, he believed, expressed his own worldview. The heroic struggle of divine titans against a world of enemies.
Hat die Dinge, die im Wagnerischen Werk
He misunderstood those things which Wagner's works express to such an extent that he confused the utopian and dramatic elements and the most impressive moments with reality.
In his own Wagnerian opera, he was both director and star. For him, everything was a stage, from the Reich Chancellery to the Festival Theatre. Even in rehearsals, he was assessing standards for his own performance. The Führer cult taken to excess. Twilight of the idols in all its splendor. Where madness rules, the absurd is not far away.
Die Partei ist Hitler. Hitler aber ist Deutschland, wie Deutschland Hitler ist.
Hitler on the move. This is how he liked to rule, moving from one homage to the next, a vagabond. He made the lifestyle of his early years into a political principle. The Chancellor and Führer of the Germans shied away from regular work. The new Reich Chancellery was often deserted. It was built only for him, Adolf Hitler. The dictator didn't think of successors. He took himself to be unique. His desk was only rarely occupied. A single great idea is worth far more than an entire life behind files, he said. So the new cabinet room was merely a museum. The ministers never met here. How could power operate from here? Was Hitler a weak dictator? Had he handed the true power over to his henchmen? Increasingly, these golden pheasants of the elite were shaping the dictatorship. Some of them were getting their hands on more than power. Hitler's rule also meant corruption, intrigue, the exercise of arbitrary power. But it didn't seem to tarnish his reputation. If only the Führer knew.
That was a nonsensical popular myth to say, if only the Führer knew. He knew a lot. He knew what his plans were. He knew he was heading for war.
Above all, he knew that nothing happened without him. Hitler's power was based on subjugation, not authority. Criticism of the Führer was high treason. He also knew he had chieftains who hastened to do things the way they thought he would like them done. They courted his favor, and internal rivalry became a means of holding on to power.
Ohne den Führer ging nichts.
It seemed nothing was possible without the Führer. He didn't do it all himself, but nothing worked without him.
Divide and rule. That was Hitler's basic law. In the administration, the army, and the party, new positions proliferated. There were more and more officials. Only the dictator held the overgrown body politic together. His orders were corset stays. That's how Hitler's rule worked.
Nichts ist möglich, wenn nicht ein Wille befiehlt, denn immer die anderen zu gehorchen haben. Von oben beginnend und ganz unten erst endend.
Thus, the Führer principle, the core of Nazi rule. The Germans learned it from an early age. The Führer's dictatorship became dictatorship of upbringing. Whoever held youth held the future, believed Hitler. He pulled out all the stops. His goal was not evolution, but breeding.
Wir müssen einen neuen Menschen erziehen, auf das unser Volk nicht an den typischen Degenerationserscheinungen dieser neuen Zeit zugrunde geht. In unseren Augen muss der deutsche Junge der Zukunft schlank und rank sein, flink wie Windhunde, zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl.
Community, not individuality. Allegiance, not criticism. Devotion, not explanations. Imperious, heroic, ready for anything. That's how the young should be. community, not individuality.
My older brother didn't want to join this mass organization, whereas I enjoyed being with others, pitting myself against others. That mattered to me more than the ideology which was constantly being preached. But the sense of community, which any of the band youth groups might have offered, that was one of the things I was looking for.
A longing for community which the seducer abused.
He represented the fatherland. I defiantly didn't want to be seen as a person who refused his duty to the fatherland, a duty to which the fatherland was entitled. I knew no other fatherland than that represented by Hitler. And it only became clear later that this fatherland was led by a murderer of Jews.
The murderer needed a war for his murderous plan. Germany was arming itself. But not at the cost of consumption. The dictator needed well-fed national comrades for his purposes. Guns and butter. Armaments on tick. In the end, it was bankruptcy or war. The dictator had made up his mind long ago. The people suspected nothing.
The dictatorship was built on the principle of the carrot and the stick. We give people the chance to go to Madeira. They'll get butter and unemployment will fall. Anyone who doesn't obey will be put up against the wall. And one day there will be war and the widow's veil.
He was seen as a savior who saved the people from that dreadful hopelessness. Many people put him on a pedestal. There was a religious feeling to it. You who know our misery, you who come to our aid.
This cult worship is almost incomprehensible today. Were the Germans blind? Here, only cheering faces can be seen, but they were not the entire population. There were people who withdrew from this mass hysteria. Amid all the cheering, they'd whisper the joke, "Why do the Germans always say hello by shouting Heil?" Because they no longer know what a good day is. The dictator wanted to keep his people in a good mood. He who wants to hold on to power must allow festivities. The high point was a piece of luck that fell into his lap, the Olympics under his dictatorship. The decision for a Berlin Olympics had been made before he came to power. Still, he took them as his games. Nothing was allowed to spoil the image of the peace-loving ruler, the wolf in sheep's clothing. The deception was perfect. The French team gave the Hitler salute as they marched in. Was that really necessary? For these people, it was a matter of course. While the world watched a peaceful Germany, Hitler was dictating a directive. A festival of peoples, so it seemed. Hitler was angered by the German crowd's enthusiasm for black athletes.
Erster Johnson, zweiter Elbritten, dritter Turbo. Amerikas Springer auf den ersten 3 Plätzen.
When Germany lost a gold medal it seemed certain to win, the dictator took it as a personal insult.
Die Dollinger fliegt davon, vergrößert den Abstand. 6, 8, 10 Meter voraus. Der Sieg ist der deutschen Staffel nicht mehr zu nehmen. Der letzte Wechsel kommt. Wechsel, die Tür fällt. Deutschland verliert den Stab. Der Weg ist frei für Amerika.
3 years later, the way was clear for Hitler. Now he could do as he pleased with the army.
Wenn ich nicht der Herr nach dem Bekannt des Generalfeldmarschalls von Blomberg entschloss, nunmehr meine Befehlsgewalt über die 3 Wehrmachtsteile direkt auszuüben, dann hoffe ich, dass wir dadurch zu jener Verstärkung unserer militärischen Machtmittel in kürzester Zeit kommen werden, die die allgemeinen Zeitumstände heute angezeigt sein lassen.
The circumstances, meaning war. Hitler celebrated his 50th birthday with the greatest military parade Germany had ever seen. The birthday of an absolute ruler. For him, the people were merely an instrument, bound to his own fate. These boots continued to echo around Germany. A year later, they marched through half of Europe. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and so on. For 4 hours, a stream of military vehicles, tanks and artillery rolled past the reviewing stand. Hitler's Reich was ready for the coming war. That was the message of this display. It was glossed over by a tradition that had already been abused. The cheering crowds did not know they were being deceived. They did not know that they were being led into war. It no longer had anything to do with their will, only his.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.